For those of you that I have not had the chance to meet yet, my name's Trevor. I serve as one of the campus pastors at SMCC broadly. So SMCC is one church in 5 locations, and I am the campus pastor at one of those other locations down in the basically Utah Valley, Utah County. So I'm at Lehigh most of the time. But get the joy of joining you all this morning. So thanks for coming on out. Thanks for being here together. So with that being said, you know, what we just read there is I feel like typically the passages we read are ones that are like very uplifting and gentle and, very clearly compassionate and loving. This one is compassionate, but it's a little bit further under the surface. And so the reason why, we're taking a little bit of time each Sunday to read something like that is because we're actually in the midst of a sermon series right now called the 7 Woes. And the 7 Woes are recorded in the 23rd chapter of Matthew. Matthew's one of the Gospels that gives us basically just like a mini biography of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. And in these 7 woes, he's challenging the religious leaders of the day on some very specific things. And so we're just taking one each week and kind of breaking it down, delving into it. The idea being that within these woes, he's addressing dangers. He's bringing awareness to dangers within their spiritual lives that they are ignorant of at that moment. And so with that awareness comes the ability to avoid those dangers and to avoid a whole lot of unnecessary pain within their lives. And so the thought is, there's something for us to glean from this as well, that if we can delve into it, if we can draw an understanding of what these dynamics are, what the dangers are that are present within their spiritual lives, then we can avoid those things as well for the sake of some greater peace and some greater joy within our lives. And so with that, I want to open up with a passage, just a verse that I think in a lot of ways ties in to our passage today. So the Bible, the biblical writings, the Bible, it's actually 66 books written across a 1,500-year period, 40 different authors, several different languages, and yet it all fits together, right? One story. But those 66 books, they open with a 5-book collection that really lay the foundation for everything that comes after. That 5-book collection. And the second book within that's called Exodus. And it gives us the story of how the people of Israel were living in Egypt, living in bondage, and they cried out to God to rescue them out of their slavery, out of their oppression. And God does, in the second half of that book, records how God brought them into this unique relationship with them and gave them really the law, or a collection of laws, to kind of organize their society around. 613 of them in total. But there's kind of a summary of those 613 known as the 10 Commandments to give a really clear understanding of right and wrong, good and evil. How do you navigate life in a good way? And the 10th of those commandments really deals specifically with our conversation today. So it reads like this, Exodus chapter 20, verse 17. It says, "You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or his male or female servant, his ox or donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor." I'll be honest, this has been a challenge for me lately. I have a neighbor who just got a new donkey, and it is impressive. That thing is, and so, we all have our own challenges, but but this is getting at the idea of the roles that jealousy and greed can play within our lives. So, okay, something about me. I'm not here that often, and so I figure I should share a little bit of myself so we can establish a relationship and have a better conversation from there. One of the things I really love to do is read. I love reading, and so I got 3 kids. My wife and I, we've got 3 kids, and I'm doing everything I can to raise them to love and enjoy books as well, because the more people there are in the world that love and enjoy books, I don't know if that makes the world better, but it makes it better for me. It makes it more fun for me. And so I want that to be true of my kids. So we just finished something, a pretty significant endeavor we embarked upon over a year ago. Just within the past 2 weeks, we read the final closing pages of The Lord of the Rings, right? That's been the bedtime reading for like over a year. And, in that moment, it's almost like a Disney movie for me, where I'm like, this is so emotional, the parting of ways and everything they've been through, and now they're not going to see each other, and I'm like fighting back tears and waves of emotion. It's like Finding Nemo all over again. And we get done, and my kids, the first thing they say is, "We liked Harry Potter better." and I'm like, one day you'll understand that you can appreciate both. But with that, there's another book that I read in the past couple of years that I think it ties into our conversation really well. It's The Pearl by John Steinbeck. So if there's any Steinbeck fans in the room, this is one of his short novels or novellas, and it tells the story of a family in kind of the early 1900s in Mexico along the coast of the Pacific Ocean in kind of a coastal town. And so the family is just, husband and wife and then a young baby boy. Kino, Juana, and Coyotito is the name of the little boy. At the beginning of the story, the boy gets stung by a scorpion. And so he develops a fever and he's not doing well. And in a lot of ways, it looks like his life is on the line. So they go to the local doctor. And yet the doctor recognizes that they're poor. They're living in poverty. They don't have funds to actually pay for the medical care that their child needs. And so the doctor just basically kind of shuts the door in their face and says, there's nothing I can do for you, nothing I'm willing to do for you. And so with that, they're kind of like at a loss for what to do. And so he does what he does pretty much every day, right? He's an oyster fisherman. So he goes out on the ocean, dives down into the ocean, finds this gigantic oyster, opens it up and finds the biggest pearl that he has ever seen in his life, that he's ever even heard of within his life. And in this moment, what he believes is that he's found the thing that will save his family. He's found the thing that will save his son, that will save his family, that will change their lives, that will change the future and the trajectory of his family's lives for generations. He believes that what he has found is the thing that will be the turning point for everyone within his family and even his own life. And yet, as the story goes on to show, he could not be more wrong. Because as soon as he takes this pearl back to the village, what he finds is that it goes on to incite the very worst of what humanity has to offer in everyone that surrounds him. Right? Neighbors and friends are breaking into his place at night trying to find where the pearl is hidden and dig it up. The doctor actually returns. The baby actually gets better just on his own. And the doctor returns to give him medicine that's designed to make him sick just so he can give something to heal that and get kind of a cut on the profits. He goes to sell the pearl to get paid for it like he does with everything else. And they're essentially trying to give him, pennies on the dollar for what this thing is worth. And he's like, no, I'm not willing to do that. He comes back home and finds his house has been actually burned to the ground. His canoe's destroyed. They have to leave the village that they've known their entire lives because it's become so violent. It's not even safe for them to stay there anymore. And then he becomes so paranoid because of everything that's happening that he actually goes on to kill some innocent herders. But in the midst of his encounter with them, a bullet goes astray and ends up taking the life of his son. So at the end of the story, what you see is the very thing that he thought was going to be the salvation for his family goes on to be the very thing that destroys them. And in a lot of ways, what the story is designed to show is just how powerful of contaminants greed and jealousy can become when they find a home within the human heart, of how destructive they can be. And it's something the biblical writings speak to a lot, right? The 10th commandment that we just looked at speaks to this reality in a way that's intending to guard the human heart from these things. And you see Jesus talking actually about this more than anything else. And so often when we have these types of conversations, when we address this particular subject, it's usually a simple problem with a simple solution, right? That the simplest remedy for jealousy and greed within our lives is just the simple practice of generosity. But I think that's where our conversation gets interesting today. Because Jesus, in this woe, he's challenging the individuals that he's challenging here, not on the basis of whether or not they're giving or even whether or not they're giving enough. It has nothing to do with whether or not they're doing it or whether the amount is pleasing to him or not. That's not even part of the conversation. Instead, it has everything to do with the heart behind their giving. And in that regard, I think you could summarize what he's saying relatively simply like this: woe to those whose giving is only about themselves. Woe to those whose generosity is only about themselves. And so with that, what I want to do is go ahead and jump into the passage now and just kind of break down the particulars and see how this is the case, and then just ask the question, what might this have for us? How could this help us avoid some dangers in our own spiritual lives so that we don't end up kind of suffering the same things that these individuals that Jesus is challenging are suffering? And so with that, Matthew 23, verses 23 to 24. Let's go ahead and pick it up there. Okay, so woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites, right? So if you're just kind of new joining us for this series, you're probably like, what is a Pharisee and why were they a hypocrite, right? What's happening here? So these are the religious leaders of the day. So in this day and age, if you had questions about God, if you were uncertain about something, if you're trying to figure out how do I navigate my spiritual life, these were the people that you spoke to. They had the role, they had the responsibility of actually providing clarity in this particular way. And yet Jesus is saying that you're hypocrites. At one point, he even calls them blind guides because they have no ability to actually guide people in the way that they have. Their responsibility is to help people navigate their spiritual lives and their relationship with God. But they have no ability to do so. They perform a relationship with God in order to win the esteem and the respect and the applause and the claps of everyone who's watching. But it really, at the end of the day, has nothing to do with God whatsoever. So they're hypocrites who perform a relationship with God as if they're on a stage when there's no relationship with God to be found. And Jesus, throughout this whole string of woes, is challenging them on individual things, right? This is what he gets into here. He says, you give a tenth of your spices, mint, dill, and cumin. So just breaking down the role of these spices. I like hummus. Hummus is a good thing. I hope that you like hummus too. But if you don't, here's what I would say. You just got to dress it up a little bit more. Sometimes it's a little bit plain Jane. And I would just say that cumin can be particularly helpful here. A little olive oil, a little paprika, a little cumin. I'm telling you, it's like night and day. And you will enjoy it so much more. In addition to that, dill. You don't get dill pickles without dill, so we know that that contributes to all of our lives. And then you don't get mojitos without mint. And so every one of these, they add a richness to our lives that would not be there without them. But what Jesus is saying here is you give a tenth of these things, right? These are spices or herbs that have they don't produce much. They're designed like they're little, they're small, they don't produce a whole lot. And he's saying that you pay such meticulous attention to detail, such scrupulous attention to detail that you actually measure out a tenth. That's what a tithe means, a tenth, 10% of these particular plants, whatever they produce, and you give that. He's saying you take what the Old Testament law is asking you to do, and you extend it even further there. But then he says, you've neglected the more important matters of the law. Justice, mercy, and faithfulness. He says you should have practiced the latter without neglecting the former. You blind guides, you strain out a gnat but swallow a camel. And that little piece that he adds at the end, that really has to do with the contrast that's at play here. And I'll be honest, I had read this for years and I was like, I don't really get it. A camel's big and a gnat's small, but what else is happening here besides that? And it turns out that they're both unclean animals. So the people of Israel, within those 613 laws, right, that gave them structure, helped them organize their society, coming out of slavery, part of what was included within that were rules or laws about what they were to eat and what they were to not eat. And so if they were to eat it, it was considered a clean animal. If they were not to eat it, it was considered unclean, an unclean animal. And both gnats and camels are considered unclean animals, right? One is big, one's small, but they're both in the category of unclean. So kind of off limits, not even on the secret menu, right? These are not allowed. And so what he's saying is in the first century context, it was common for gnats to basically find their way into wine. And what he's saying is you pay such meticulous attention to detail on this particular issue, this rule, that you strain out your wine to remove the gnats, not because you think it's gross, but just because you're taking this to such an extremity. But then you turn around and, metaphorically speaking, you swallow a camel, right? You strain out a gnat to avoid drinking that, but then you swallow a camel. And really the contrast there is like you're tithing on these tiny little things, but you're completely ignoring justice, faithfulness, and mercy, the things that are actually very core to the heart of God. And so I think the question is, well, what is justice, mercy, and faithfulness? What do these things look like? And I think to break those down really quickly, you could look at it like this. Justice is just to do what is right. Justice is to do what is right. I remember being like 20 years old, reading Plato's Republic, and I got through to the end of that thing. The whole thing's about justice. And I got to the end of it, and I was like, I'm not sure I understand this, and I think I like Harry Potter better also. But part of what's happening there is, Proverbs 21:3, to do what is right and just is more acceptable to the Lord than sacrifice. In order to actually do what is right, to do what is good, we have to have an understanding of what right and wrong are, what good and evil are. And I think what's fascinating, you can see this throughout the biblical writings, that societies at time and groups, and they lose sight of what these things are. Not that they lose the terms, it's just over the course of time, the definitions shift and move further and further away from what God actually defines as good and evil and right and wrong. And so in order to actually understand how to live out justice in the context of our lives, we have to understand what good and evil are, what right and wrong are in the context of how God defines those things, which he offers to us in the biblical writings, right? So that's what justice is. Mercy comes next. Mercy is to have compassion for others in their suffering. We live in an incredibly broken and flawed world. You don't have to go very far to discover that reality. Pretty much everyone, my guess would be every single person within this room at some point has come face to face with the reality of the brokenness of this world. And what that is that's suffering. Every one of us has experienced suffering, likely will experience suffering, and there's probably a good chunk of us who currently are experiencing suffering. And what mercy is to recognize the suffering that a person is going through and essentially to be moved by compassion for them, to engage with them in a way that takes into consideration the suffering that they are going through. And that's what mercy is. And God says in Hosea 6:6, I desire mercy, not sacrifice, acknowledgement of God rather than burnt offerings. Which I think is pretty fascinating. Okay, third one, faithfulness. This is to embrace your dependence on God. I'll be honest, I kind of struggled with the wording around this one. And part of the reason why I drafted it out this way is because I think Jesus is in a lot of ways drawing on this passage in Micah 6:8. This is kind of a key and an important passage within the Old Testament writings. So Micah 6:8 says, he has shown you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? To act justly and to love mercy and to walk humbly with your God. So you see justice, you see mercy, and then you don't see the specific language around faithfulness, but you do see to walk humbly with your God, humility, a recognition of our dependence on God, that in every aspect of life, in every relationship, in every responsibility, if we're going to show up in a way that's honoring to God, the reality is we need God to do that we're unable, in a sense, to do that without God's provision and his grace within our lives. And yet I think maybe an alternative way to get at what faithfulness is that's maybe a little bit clearer is just this idea that a faithful person is a person that you can trust. And trust is really just the ability to be at ease with someone, to be vulnerable, to open ourselves up. In a sense, it's like we're allowing this person, either through the things we're sharing with them or the way we're being around them, we're giving them the opportunity to cause us pretty significant harm because we trust that they're not going to, because they're faithful. That's what faithfulness is. And so what we see is that Jesus is saying that the weightier matters of the law, meaning the Old Testament in its entirety, are justice, mercy, and faithfulness, because these are the things that are at the very core of who God is. And I think what's fascinating is if you just consider the role that these things play within the world, I think one of the ways that you find maybe the most compelling argument for how important, how significant these things are, if you just ask the question, what would the world look like if you took these things away? If you take your place of work, or you take your community, take whatever it might be, whatever context it might be, even look at a particular relationship and say, what would this look like if I removed justice? If I removed mercy? If I removed faithfulness? What you would find, it is an incredibly chaotic and violent world where you had the ability to trust absolutely no one. To me, that sounds like about the worst thing that you could imagine in drafting out a way to live in this world, is the removal of those things. And so what that tells us is that the contrast is also true, that if you build a world, if you build a family, if you build a team, if you build an organization upon these things, what you find is the type of culture in which people can heal, in which people can get kind of some sense of stability, in which relationships can grow, in which trust can be fostered, in which people can actually flourish as individuals with a sense of peace and a sense of joy, and even a sense of purpose. But if you remove those things, you remove the possibility of all of that. And so I think it's really interesting here that in so many ways, Jesus, he ties these concepts together of, on the one hand, generosity, and on the other hand, these weightier matters of the law, faithfulness, justice, and mercy. And I'll get to that more in a second. But I just want to say this about it, that I think the reason he ties these together is because they're intended to be tied together. That there are so many different ways. In a sense, there are countless different ways that we could show up in the context of our relationships, our responsibilities, all of these different areas that we could show up that leads to a world marked by more justice, more faithfulness, and more mercy. And yet I think the reason that he links these subjects together is just because of this idea that giving in and of itself, that generosity in and of itself is perhaps the most significant way that we embrace these things, that we embrace a dependence on God and invest in a more just and merciful world. And here's why I say that. Because if you consider, like, the church is the organization, the institution, more than anything else, that Jesus actually committed himself to. Matthew 16:18, he says that essentially, I will build my church and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. That more than any other organization, Jesus has committed himself to the church. It is his plan A, and there is no plan B. And if you think about what a church is intended to do, we're meant to essentially gather together on a regular basis to draw our attention to God, to encourage each other in our lives and our responsibilities, to encourage each other to tend to our relationship with God and to grow in our understanding of what justice is, what mercy is, and what faithfulness is. And as a result of that, we become people who are more marked by those things. And on the other side of that, we have the ability to go out and do what actually truly is the most important work that any church does, which is not what happens here, but it's what happens when we leave. Because when you leave, you go back into what makes up your life the rest of the week, right? You go back into your family. You go back into your friendships. You go back into your place of work. You go back into the business that you run. You go back into the team that you manage. You go back into the kids that you're raising and shaping and forming. And as a result of what happens here, you have the ability to engage in every single one of those things in a way that brings greater justice and greater mercy and greater faithfulness. And as a direct result of that, what we get to experience is a world that is more marked by each and every one of those things. And so essentially what I'm trying to say is, when you give to support a community like this, you're investing in a more just and merciful, in a more faithful world. And yet again, when we come back to the passage, Jesus links these things together because in some ways there seems to be a separation between them. And I think the question is, well, what's happening there? And I think if you come back to the Pharisees, these religious leaders, what you find is that giving was not something that was linked to the pursuit of these things within their lives, but instead it was almost the opposite. For them, I think you could say giving was about rules rather than relationship. And what Jesus is saying is that giving is about relationships, not rules. That giving is fundamentally relational. Generosity is fundamentally relational. And I think you could break it down like this, that for them, essentially what Jesus invites us into is that generosity is something we do to invest in a world that is more marked by these things. And so for that reason, it's our compassion for other people. It's our commitment to justice. It's our faithfulness as individuals that actually motivates us to even try generosity within the first place. And yet for these Pharisees, what they were doing is it's almost like they gave in order to justify their ability to turn a blind eye to what was happening in the world. That if I give, then I've checked this box and I've done what I need to do, and I really don't have to care about justice in my life or in the places that I inhabit. I really don't have to care about mercy in my life or in the relationships that I have or what's happening around me. If I check this box, then I've checked the most important box, you could say, when it comes to faithfulness. And so I don't really have to be concerned about what happens in all of these other areas. I don't have to be faithful when it comes to justice and mercy if I've been faithful here. In so many ways, it's as if they were checking this box so they could keep God at arm's length. And Jesus speaks about giving again and again and again and again, because so often we have the tendency to place our ultimate hope in our finances, just like the story of the pearl. And that's one of the quickest things we can do to bring destruction into our lives, into our sense of peace, into our sense of joy, into our sense of purpose. But it's also possible to give in a way where we're giving perhaps from our wallet, perhaps from our finances, and yet we're doing so in a way that has nothing to do with the heart at all. We're actually giving in order to keep God away from us. If you look at it like this, look at like a parent-child relationship. Just imagine this. The parent who continually showers their kids with gifts, right? That there's new clothes every time they come home. There's new presents. Christmas is always a massive ordeal. And yet, when it comes to the time actually spent in that relationship, there's almost nothing. That's the equivalent where you substitute finances for relationship. You substitute money for relationship. And Jesus is saying, if that's the way that you've been giving, then you might as well just stop. Because giving is about relationships. It's motivated by our relationship with Him and also by compassion for other people and to invest in a more just world for us, for our kids, for other people. It is fundamentally and foundationally relational. And the best example of that is Jesus, who was willing to give Himself, right? Take on our humanity, live the perfect life you and I could never live, and then give Himself, give His life, enter into even death on our behalf, dying in our place to bring about our forgiveness and our redemption and our restoration to Him. It was a giving that in no way was motivated by checking a box or keeping a collection of rules. It was motivated by love for you. And how the invitation is for us to find our worth there, to place our hope there rather than in the pearl. And in essence, to let that be what shapes the way that we engage in every single aspect of our lives for a more just, a more merciful, and a more faithful world. That's why the bottom line is, happy are those whose generosity is fueled not by rules, but by love. Because generosity is fundamentally relational. Would you pray with me? Jesus, we give you praise for the time together this morning. We thank you for the chance to dive into your word, to break it down, to see the ways that it challenges us. We thank you that you're one who's never content to just leave us alone with our own devices that will damage and cause destruction within our lives, but instead you are willing to challenge us. You're willing to do whatever's necessary to draw us back into the relationship with you that we're made for. And so we thank you for your generosity. We thank you for your willingness to sacrifice yourself on our behalf. And we thank you that because you are more just than we could ever recognize and more merciful than we could ever imagine, we can trust you and know that you are faithful. And in the highs and lows of life, in all of it, we can trust you because you are faithful beyond compare. And so we thank you and we praise you for the opportunity to gather together, to turn our attention to you and to be changed by it. And so for all this, we ask and pray in your name. Amen.